April Tinsley was 8 years old when she was murdered in Indiana, but the killer did not disappear. 16 years later, he was still leaving messages for children. Some of those messages were accompanied by biological evidence connected to the same man investigators believed had killed April. The killer apparently thought the communications would frighten an entire community. Instead, they would eventually help investigators find him. Before this documentary ends, we will uncover why he returned after years of silence, how police used his own communications against him, and how a family tree built from deoxyribonucleic acid finally led detectives to a man who had escaped identification for 3 decades. April 1988, Fort Wayne, Indiana. April Tinsley was 8 years old. She was a first grader. It was Good Friday. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation's historical account of the case, April disappeared while moving through her neighborhood on what should have been an ordinary afternoon. 3 days later, she was found dead approximately 20 miles away in a rural part of Indiana. Investigators determined she had been abducted and sexually assaulted before being murdered. What matters is what investigators had afterward: a devastated family, a frightened community, physical evidence, and no identified killer. For April's family, the mystery began immediately. Someone had taken a child from a familiar neighborhood and vanished back into ordinary life. Police did not yet know whether the offender was a stranger passing through or someone who could live nearby without attracting attention. But the person responsible had left behind something far more valuable than he understood. The killer had left physical evidence, but in 1988 science could not yet tell police whose it was. Deoxyribonucleic acid profiling was still developing rapidly during the late 1980s. A biological sample could potentially connect crimes to one another, but only if investigators had something to compare it against. A deoxyribonucleic acid profile without a suspect is like a fingerprint without a database match. It can tell investigators that the same individual appears in multiple places. It cannot automatically supply a name. This distinction becomes central to the April Tinsley case, because years later the killer would provide investigators with more material. Not accidentally, at the original crime scene, deliberately, while communicating with them. And the first known message appeared 2 years after April's death. In 1990, a disturbing message appeared on a barn door near the area where April had been found. The writer claimed responsibility for killing her and threatened to kill again. The Federal Bureau of Investigation later publicly displayed photographs of that message while appealing for information in the case. This changed the psychological dimension of the investigation entirely. If authentic, the writer was not trying to disappear completely. He wanted someone to know that he was still there. Perhaps he wanted attention, perhaps control, perhaps fear. Investigators could not responsibly assume motive without evidence. But the behavior raised one unavoidable question. Why would someone who had escaped identification risk communicating again? That question would become even more important 14 years later, because the next messages were not left on an isolated barn. They were placed where children could find them. In the spring of 2004, 4 similar notes appeared around Fort Wayne. According to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, 3 were placed on bicycles belonging to young girls inside the girls' own yards. The notes referenced April's murder and threatened future violence. Several were sealed inside plastic bags, and investigators found something else inside some of those packages: used condoms, Polaroid photographs, biological material. Laboratory testing connected material from the later communications to the same offender profile associated with April's murder. The man trying to terrorize Fort Wayne had effectively preserved his genetic signature for investigators. That did not identify him immediately, but it told investigators they were not chasing an anonymous copycat based only on handwriting. The communications and the original crime could now be connected scientifically. The packages also contained additional clues. One photograph showed a distinctive patterned bedspread. Investigators began asking hotels and bedding suppliers whether they recognized it. Another clue involved the type of instant camera used. Police looked for people who still owned or purchased Polaroid film. Every object mattered. Every background detail mattered. Every communication created another chance for the killer to make a mistake. The messages were meant to show that the killer remained in control. But every message gave police something new to investigate. One detail troubled investigators. 3 of the 2004 notes had been placed on bicycles in girls' yards. That required proximity. Someone had entered or approached residential property, deposited the material, and left without creating enough suspicion to be immediately identified. Federal Bureau of Investigation investigators asked a practical question: who could move through these neighborhoods without looking out of place? The offender seemed comfortable enough in northeastern Fort Wayne and Allen County to move through neighborhoods and leave evidence behind. That suggested geographic familiarity. In 2009, the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Analysis Unit published a profile based on 16 years of offender behavior. Investigators believed the offender likely had strong ties to northeast Fort Wayne or Allen County and might live, work, or routinely shop there. Police now had geography, behavior, and deoxyribonucleic acid. What they still did not have was a name. In 2009, the investigation received another major push. The Federal Bureau of Investigation deployed members of its child abduction rapid deployment team to Fort Wayne. Roughly 75 agents, detectives, analysts, and command personnel were involved in the renewed effort. 25 investigative teams worked neighborhoods, interviews, and old leads. They revisited the barn, they examined the Polaroid evidence, they sought voluntary deoxyribonucleic acid samples from potential suspects, and they used a crisis management platform called Orion to organize the enormous volume of information accumulated since 1988. Every exclusion mattered. If a person's deoxyribonucleic acid did not match the unidentified profile, investigators could move on. But the process still depended on finding the correct person first. Traditional deoxyribonucleic acid databases did not produce the answer. Years passed. April's photograph remained with investigators. The killer's deoxyribonucleic acid remained in evidence, and science kept advancing. By 2015, investigators tried another emerging technology. Fort Wayne police worked with Parabon nanolabs to generate investigative predictions about physical appearance from the unidentified offender's deoxyribonucleic acid. The goal was not to create a photograph, it was to produce another lead. A deoxyribonucleic acid-based composite could suggest traits that might help the public narrow possibilities, but it could not identify one person by itself. In 1988, deoxyribonucleic acid was evidence waiting for a comparison. By 2015, the same biological material could help estimate appearance, but investigators still needed a way to move from deoxyribonucleic acid to a family to a person. 3 years later, that method arrived. In 2018, investigative genetic genealogy was rapidly transforming cold case investigations. Instead of asking whether the offender's deoxyribonucleic acid directly matched a known criminal profile, genealogists could search for genetic relatives in permitted genealogy databases. A distant match might identify a cousin. That cousin could lead to grandparents. Those grandparents could lead to multiple family branches. Investigators could then work forward through birth records, marriages, locations, and ages until they found individuals who fit the case. The April Tinsley evidence was submitted for genealogical investigation. Genetic genealogist C.C. Moore and Parabon nanolabs used genealogy information to narrow the possible source of the deoxyribonucleic acid to two brothers in the Fort Wayne area. One of them was John D. Miller of Grabille, Indiana, but genealogy is an investigative lead. It is not a conviction. Detectives still needed a direct comparison, and that meant obtaining Miller's deoxyribonucleic acid lawfully and testing it against the evidence. Investigators collected discarded items from Miller's trash. Laboratory testing produced the critical result. The deoxyribonucleic acid matched the offender profile linked to April's case and to the biological evidence accompanying the 2004 communications. Consider the full timeline. 1988, evidence from the murder. 2004, evidence deliberately left with threatening notes. 2018, evidence discarded outside the home of the man genealogy had identified. All three pointed to the same individual. For 30 years, investigators had possessed pieces of one genetic trail. Modern genealogy finally told them where to look for the final comparison. Now detectives had the deoxyribonucleic acid, but they still wanted to hear what Miller would say. On July 15, 2018, investigators approached John D. Miller. According to the probable cause account reported at the time, when detectives asked whether he knew why they wanted to talk to him, Miller named April Tinsley. He subsequently confessed to abducting and killing her. The deoxyribonucleic acid identification was followed by an admission. 3 decades after April disappeared, the unidentified genetic profile finally had a name. In December 2018, John D. Miller pleaded guilty to murder and child molestation. An Indiana judge sentenced him to 80 years in prison. Family members filled the courtroom. Retired investigators who had carried April's picture through years of work were there as well. 30 years had passed between crime and conviction. The killer aged. Detectives retired. Technology transformed, but the evidence remained. The April Tinsley investigation became part of a larger transformation in forensic science. Investigative genetic genealogy showed that an offender could escape traditional deoxyribonucleic acid databases and still be identified through biological relationships. You do not necessarily need the killer's deoxyribonucleic acid already stored under his name. A distant relative may be enough to start building the path, but the method also creates legitimate questions about privacy. A person uploading genetic information may reveal biological connections involving relatives who never uploaded anything themselves. That creates a tension between solving serious violent crimes and defining appropriate limits for genetic investigation. The technology solved an extraordinarily difficult case. That does not eliminate the need for clear rules around how such tools should be used. April Tinsley should not be remembered primarily because of what her killer did after her death. She was 8 years old. Her family spent 3 decades without knowing who had taken her life. Investigators carried her photograph for years because the case was never simply an intellectual puzzle. It was a promise that someone still owed a child an answer. Here is what can be confirmed from the full timeline. 1988, April murdered. 1990, barn message appears. 2004, threatening notes placed on bicycles. 2009, Major Federal Bureau of Investigation cold case push. 2015, deoxyribonucleic acid phenotyping. 2018, genetic genealogy identifies Miller. July 2018, Miller arrested. December 2018, guilty plea and 80-year sentence. The killer spent years using communication as a weapon. But the most important thing he sent was not a threat. It was his deoxyribonucleic acid. The messages designed to prove that he could not be stopped helped create the evidence trail that ultimately identified him. What do you believe really happened psychologically when Miller decided to communicate again after years of silence? And how should investigators balance the extraordinary power of forensic genealogy with the privacy rights of innocent relatives, the messages stopped, the deoxyribonucleic acid remained, and 30 years after April Tinsley was murdered, science finally gave investigators the name they had been searching for.